also says that he was standing there approving of Stephen when he was killed. There was this apostle, his name was Stephen, this is a follower of Christ. He was killed, and Paul stood there and held everybody's coats watching this. He held their coats while they killed this guy named Stephen. Well, Paul says, you know what? I'm not as great as I think. I'm not as great as you think. I haven't achieved it yet. He says, but I forget the past and I look forward to heaven, to what God is offering me. Now, guys, look up here for a second. Just look up here. If you've ever done something wrong, God can forgive you if you admit it. God can cleanse your heart and say, you know what? You don't have to live in that guilt anymore. I've forgiven you. You can forgive yourself. But the way to do that is to keep growing in your faith, trusting Him. We move forward regardless. Now notice this. Jesus Christ was crucified. He was risen from the dead. The apostles and the disciples run to the grave, and they're trying to see if Jesus is still there. They find the stone rolled away, and then this other group comes, and they find two angels sitting there. Now notice what the angel says to these followers of Christ. He says this, but go and tell his disciples. We'll tell them what? Jesus is alive. Jesus is risen from the dead. Go tell the disciples He's alive. Now notice this. And Peter. The angel specifically says, don't forget to tell Peter. Can you imagine what Peter was feeling like? He had just betrayed his best friend. He denied him in front of people. And the Lord looked at him the moment he did that. And he's off. He's fishing again, doing his own thing. And the Bible says God remembered him. Remember Peter. Now notice this. No matter where you find yourself out in life, God knows where you're at. And God can help you to move forward. And no matter what kind of mistakes you've done in life, God remembers you. And He wants to continue to help you to move forward in your faith. Now notice this. Christ wanted Peter, but Peter had to also learn to follow Him more. Remember I talked about being humble? Well, notice number 2 on your outline. The second thing I need to do to become humble and to overcome my past is pursue God's path. Number 2 is pursuing God's path. You know what? The interesting thing about God's path is this. It's a trust issue. How many of you ever had somebody who you thought was your friend and they broke your trust and you had a hard time trusting them? It's kind of like that with God. In order to follow God's plan for your life, you have to trust Him. God, do you really have my best interest in hand? Do you really want to bless my life? God, are you really going to see me through these difficulties? It's a trust issue. And sooner or later, we have to ask ourselves, are we going to trust God? Now, Peter had to ask himself this question, am I going to really follow God? Am I going to do that? Now, remember, he had denied Him. He went to the cross. He rose from the dead. And they came to Him and said, Jesus is asking about you. God is asking about you. He sent this angel to talk to you. Now, notice this. Jesus comes along after the resurrection. The Bible says He hung around for 40 days on this earth after the resurrection, talking and meeting people. He comes to Peter. Now, notice what happens in this exchange. You remember the last time He saw Peter, right? Well, notice this. When they had finished eating, on your outline, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? Do you truly love me more than these? Remember what He said earlier? I don't care if anybody else just walks away from you, God. I will never forsake you. I'll go to my grave telling everybody that, yeah, I love you. Well, it's interesting because in the Greek, the words have a little bit different meaning. I want to kind of share that meaning with you. So I'm not reading into it. I'm kind of explaining what the English can't explain as far as this. But I want you to get this. Jesus says this, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? With this agape love, with this love, that divine love, do you really love me that much more than these? Now, Peter didn't want to stick his foot back in his mouth. Remember, he had just done that. Notice how he responds. Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Here's what he really said, and I just want to paraphrase it for you. Jesus says, do you really love me, Peter? With all your heart, a divine love? And Peter says this, yes, Jesus, you know that I'm fond of you. Big difference, right? Yes, Jesus, you know that I'm fond of you. Again, Jesus says, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me with this divine love? Do you truly love me, Simon? He answered, Lord, you know that I'm fond of you. Lord, yeah, I love you, but I can't admit that right now. In my heart, I just let you down. You looked right at me, Lord, when I denied you. Notice this. Jesus says, take care of my sheep. Jesus is putting that mantle back on him again. Not only are you going to preach my word, but you're going to take care of the people. You're going to be in leadership, Peter. Notice this. A third time, he says to him, Simon, son of John. Now notice this. Jesus says this. Are you fond of me? Jesus changed his word, that love word. And he said, Peter, I'm going to meet you exactly where you're able to meet me right now. Peter, I love you. Do you truly love me? And he says, I'm fond of you, Lord. And then Jesus looks at him the third time, and he says, Peter, are you fond of me? Are you fond of me? Do you love me that much at least? Now notice this. Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I'm fond of you. And Jesus says, feed my sheep. Now the amazing thing about this is no matter what path you're on right now, God can meet you there. And he can say, you know what? Wherever you're able to meet me, I'll meet you there. And I'll put you back on the right path. Now I want you to notice this path that Peter was about to take. Jesus says to him, I tell you the truth. When you were younger and you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Notice this. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Jesus starts to tell Peter, remember when you could go and do whatever you wanted? There's a day that's coming when you're going to die and people are going to take you where you don't want to go and they're going to do things to you that you don't want done. And he's thinking, man, Lord, is that what it's going to take to follow you? Notice this. Then he said to him, follow me. And Peter turned and saw that disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. And this was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and said, Lord, who is going to betray you? Who is he talking about? The Apostle John. Notice what Peter says. This is so classic. When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? Lord, what about John? If I'm going to die, what about him? Notice what he says. Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I come, what is that to you? You must follow me. You know, I love being a follower of Christ because God takes the average person and he puts them on the path that he wants them to go. I wasn't planning on being a pastor. I told you a lot of that. I told you all that before. I had a different path in mind for my life, but God chose me to meet me where I am, to put me on this path. And God may not call you to be a pastor or a missionary or something like that, but wherever he has you, he can put you on his path to live for him. You can live for him doing any job, any career that you can, but you've got to be willing to go down the path. You know, it's interesting. The Bible doesn't tell us, but history kind of tells us this, and the story goes like this, that when Peter was taken away and he was to be killed, he was so ashamed, not of his life, but he didn't find himself worthy to be killed the way they wanted him to be killed. They were going to crucify him. And Peter said, you know what? I'm not worthy enough to be crucified like my Lord. And he says, hang me upside down. And so they hung Peter upside down on a cross. And that's how they killed him. That was the path that Peter chose to take. Now notice this. I want to give you 3 things really quick. You just might want to write these down. I don't think they're on your outline. But I've noticed that there's something that God does in people's lives when He wants them to learn how to be humble. Number 1 is this. He calls them to do something. So there's a calling. You might want to write that down. There's a calling upon your life. And God has called you to be a follower of His. You're going to be a good one or you're going to be a bad one. You're going to be a good husband or you're going to be a bad wife. Or a bad husband. Good. Sorry, let me go back. Mistake. Let me overcome that. Sorry, dear. You're going to be a good husband or you're going to be a bad